I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. I'm delighted to play for you part 2 of my interview with Ken Kratz. It's the only interview I've ever lost track of the time. I was that fascinated and riveted by what Ken Kratz had to say, and surprised, and I hope you are too. So here it is. One of my frustrations with talking with Avery supporters or Avery and Dassey supporters about this case, which is they make assumptions about what they think. I mean, they're completely untrained. They say there's too much blood, or there's not enough blood, or there's not enough evidence here, or he wouldn't have left the car. To put your rational frame of mind into the mind of someone who just committed murder, it's a little bit like saying, well, O.J. Simpson wouldn't just kill his wife right before he's about to take a flight for Chicago, right? With the car waiting. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It all sounds absurd.
Here's what I talked about before. The willingness of people to suspend their common sense. Let me talk about two things, okay? The first, Stephen Avery had a police scanner set up in his living room the day that Teresa Halbach was killed. You can hear it because when he talks to Jody on the phone, who's in jail, you can hear the scanner chirping in the background. You know what, Steve? On Halloween night, after Teresa Halbach is, from all rational evidence, dead by now, why are you listening to the cop radio? Why do you wonder if the cops are coming? He doesn't know if he's going to report Teresa missing. He has 4 days, but he never knows when they're coming. He knows they're coming. He just doesn't know when. And so he puts on a police scanner. Now, your listeners who realize Steve didn't have that scanner in his house, the weeks and months before the Halbach murder, it's just then that he thought he needed his police scanner on. Coincidence? I'm not sure. But the day after, the very next day, November 1st, Stephen Avery shampoos all the carpets in his trailer. Well, if you know Stephen Avery and you know what a slob he is, you will know that that's not consistent with his character. You wouldn't expect him just got a hankering for shampooing all the rugs and taking his bedroom with his configuration and moving all the furniture around until it was in a different place that it was the day before. Your viewers may look at that as a coincidence and all of these things as coincidental. Most people, though, that have the benefit of and the gift of common sense, look at those kind of things and say, well, it makes me at least ask another question, makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit. Yet when I bring up these things, as you know, Roberta, I'm the one that's attacked for it. How dare you, Ken, bring up, all these things? Well, I brought it up in trial. I showed them the rug doctor, the shampooer. I know that 2 days later, on Thursday, the 3rd of November, Stephen Avery takes the rug doctor back to the store that he got it from, and he gets a different carpet shampooer. So why is it, after he wonders what kinds of liquid, what kind of blood, what kind of traces are inside of this rug doctor that I have, I know on Thursday, I will take it back to where I bought it from, and I'll get a new one so that one is forever discarded. Again, your viewers or your listeners may think of that as a coincidence. All right. But that's just something that everybody, would do a day or two after this girl's murdered. But when you look at his behavior, his cleaning, the bleach that he's using, the paint thinner, the efforts that he made to take that burn pit and to move as many of the bones as he could, to move the big bones that were in there over to the burn barrel of the Dassey and Yonda family, all these things that Stephen Avery took upon himself to clean up. Stephen knew that those big bones needed to be burned again, and so he asked his nephew, Brendan, his accomplice, why don't we have another bonfire tonight? And that was on Thursday, the 3rd. We know that because Brendan tells officers on November 6th, when he's first interviewed, just a couple of days later, that Steve wanted to have a bonfire on Thursday. Steve probably didn't tell Brendan that we need another burning of these large bones. So let's invite some friends and have a big fire again tonight. When they tell Barb, Brendan's mom, that they intend to have a bonfire that night, it ends up in this huge argument, this huge fight. And you can hear it on phone calls. You can hear the fight that night on Thursday the 3rd. Brendan talks about this knockdown, drag-out fight that Barb and Steve have. Well, why? What happened on the 3rd? What happened that made Barb so angry about Stephen? Well, what happens that we now know is that her other son, Bobby Dassey, on the 3rd, told Barb that I saw Teresa walk toward the trailer, that when I left, her car was still there, and nobody saw her again. So when Bobby says that on the 3rd, my opinion again, my own look at this case, something clicked for Barb. Now it became really close to home. Now she remembers back to the 31st when there was this big bonfire where the flames were as high as the garage, when any number of people saw that fire, her and Scott Taddick and Candy Avery and Kayla and all these people that will later say that flames were so high down there that they knew that there was this big bonfire. Well, Barb now remembers that when she got home, Brendan was standing next to Stephen up by the fire. So now she's thinking, stay away from my kid. And you're going to hear that later in phone calls. Those of you that have access to all of the jail calls, you're going to hear that after the 3rd, Barb becomes really protective of Brendan. Stay away from my kid. And after Brendan is eventually arrested, you hear the phone call, the really heart-wrenching phone call between Steve and Barb, when Barb says, why did you do this? Why did you involve my kid? And Steve, bless his heart, says, well, don't believe your kid or all the evidence. Believe your brother. Why wouldn't you believe your brother? Well, Barb knew then. It clicked for her. She, I think, knew all the way back when Steve wanted another bonfire the very day that Teresa's announced missing. Barb's not going to let that happen. And so your listeners may not know that. And so instead of burning all the bones again in the bonfire, having the second fire on Thursday, Steve takes those to burn barrel number 2, and he reburns them. He burns up, or at least tries to burn up, those larger human bones that hadn't burned all the way up in the burn barrel. And of course, during the search, they find these bones. Leslie Eisenberg, as clearly as she could, the forensic anthropologist, the smartest woman I've ever met in my life, told the jury that those bones, those are in burn barrel 2, were moved to that location, not from that location. And the easy answer to that was, how do you know that, Leslie? Because she said there were a bunch of other bones in there that weren't human. So if you're going to, what are you going to do? Burn everything in there and then just take out just the human bones with no other mixing in of any bones and put those in the fire pit because no chicken bones or beef bones were found in Stephen's fire pit. But they're all in the Dassey burn barrel. He's commingled all these things now and was burning these things all together. Well, again, unless you're suspending common sense, you have to know that those bones then were put there, okay, that were moved there from the primary burn location. And so all of these reveals or all of these, these great theories by the defense were already talked about, already dispelled at trial if people are just willing to go and look at them.
How would you get access to the complete jailhouse phone calls? Are they up somewhere?
No. I think okay. Those are all open records, Freedom of Information Act kinds of things. There are many, as you know, there are many of them out there. There's a whole slew of them. But I'll tell you what, Roberta, you guys haven't heard them all. And they all haven't been released. And when everybody hears some of those phone calls, when they hear Laura Riccardi, the filmmaker, when Brendan Dassey is arrested, who's at Avery's house, do you think? It's not Dean Strang. It's not Steve Glynn or any other attorney. It's Laura Riccardi. The filmmaker is already there embedding herself with the family. She gets on the phone with Steve the day that Brendan's arrested, and she assures Stephen, we're still on your side, Steve. We called your mom as soon as we heard, whatever we can do to help. Well, does that sound like a journalist to you, Roberta? Or does that sound like an advocate? Does that sound like somebody who's on Avery's side? You know what I'm saying? So the fact that she's there at the most critical time when Barb is going through this heart-wrenching stuff and when Steve's ma is talking and all these moving parts are happening, well, Laura Riccardi, it turns out, the Making a Murderer filmmaker, is smack dab in the middle of all of it. And so to suggest that she's just looking for the truth, or those kind of things, there's going to be a reckoning when everybody hears all the jail calls, especially with Laura Riccardi. You remember, I know you do, because in the fall of '06, I tried to subpoena her footage. I said, she's not a journalist. She's an advocate. She's working for the defense team. She's giving the defense team all this stuff. And she brought an affidavit, a sworn statement to court saying we haven't given the defense any of the stuff, that we're journalists, and we're basically keeping it all for ourselves when Stephen Avery, the client, is on jail calls telling his friends, yeah, Laura is working on my case. She's this documentary filmmaker, and she's promised to give everything to the defense attorneys. Well, where do you think Steve got that from? You think he just made that up? Or do you think that was an agreement, was a conversation, an agreement why Laura would get to work on their case as long as you give everything to the defense? So I think Ms. Riccardi's got some splaining to do. I think when she came to court and swore to the court that nothing was being given to the defense, I think some of the evidence may suggest otherwise. And someday she may be asked those questions either by the media or somebody more formally.
I've just heard parts of the tapes in your videos, and an interesting part of those tapes is that Stephen Avery doesn't really deny murdering Teresa. For one,
no, never does. And especially not to Barb. Barb knows who killed Teresa. I mean, he's not going to insult her. He just says,
teach your kid better not to talk to the cops, right. He says, right?
you know what the question was? When she says, my kid said that this murder occurred. Why'd that happen? And instead of Stephen saying, well, maybe he's mistaken, or I don't know why he would say that about me or anything, yeah. Right? His answer is because you let him. Wow. Well, what kind of answer is that? Mm-hmm. Why would my kids say, because it's your fault, Barb, because you were supposed to train your kids not to talk to the cops. And that's a theme that you're going to hear a lot, that Barb's actually blamed by Avery's parents for letting her kids talk to the cops, not training them well enough that the family, doctrine, the mantra is, we don't like cops. We don't talk to cops. Remember Brendan saying that in his trial when asked about why he lied to the police. He said, because our whole family hates cops. So that's something to, I don't know, maybe put into the calculus, into something that when considering who to believe or exactly what kind of dynamics were at play here, those are things that at least people that take such a deep dive into this case might find interesting.
Yeah, and there's this one part where he says, I'm blaming it on the state.
Mm-hmm.
That's
just
all
like Scott, right?
I didn't do it. That's my plan, to blame it on the state.
Just and an aside on that case, there are jail calls that you don't hear where Avery is developing the cops' planted evidence, from the very beginning. So this isn't a new thing for him. He was thinking about this from day one. In fact, before the cops ever arrested him, he suggested that if they found evidence, then it was because they planted it. So, it's a conclusion. You come up with the conclusion, and then you backfill it later to try to find things that support it. That's what Making a Murderer did. Their conclusion was that this guy was screwed by the system and by cops and these prosecutors. And so that was their answer. And then they built their story around it, the confirmation bias, those things. If it didn't suggest it, then they made it up. Then they made up stuff that made these cops look sketchy. And to me, that's unforgivable. It's not something that can continue to happen.
Where do you think Stephen Avery's enormous confidence that he could get away with this rape and murder came from? Where do you think it came from?
I don't know. I have no idea what was in his mind, what he thought. My theory of the whole case is that he knew when he was in prison that when he got out, he was going to rape and kill women. Why do I know that? Because he said it. He said it to his inmates. He and another inmate drew up a torture chamber, plans for here's how I'm going to abduct, rape, torture, kill women. And the best way to get rid of a body is to burn it. Well, when he says, I'm going to do it, and when he does it, why is everybody so surprised? Why is everybody's mouth hanging open saying, gee, where'd that come from, Steve? Well, he said he was going to do it. That's what's inside of him. He predicted it. He telegraphed he was going to do it. And then when he did it, people still acted, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. Well,
Did you listen to Jodi's interview that she gave?
Sure. The HLN interview?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A question just as an aside.
Yeah.
Did you hear the backlash, the horrible things that women said about Jodi for reporting this long history of domestic violence where she was afraid for her life? Did you see how she got trashed when she came out and told her truth?
Yes.
That was despicable.
I was trashed too with it for believing that liar and blah, blah, blah. I got it too because horrible. I think I felt so much for her, and I believe her story, and it's backed up by the way he treated his first wife. So
of course, you know that she came to the filmmakers, right? You know she went to the filmmakers and said, all that stuff I told you that you filmed of me in Making a Murderer was a lie. I was afraid Stephen was going to hurt me or worse when I said that. So please don't use that. What do you think Riccardi did with that? Nothing. She used it anyway. She never told anybody that Jodi said what I said to you was a lie and that I was put up to it or forced to say that by Stephen. You never hear any of that. Even after the fact, you don't hear Laura Riccardi talking about this poor domestic abuse victim. And she asked her, please don't use those things that I told you because he made me say them all. Well, why not? I mean, why aren't you at least telling people that she's had a change of heart or that she's making these allegations? Instead, years later, you take these statements that you had harvested from this poor woman and you present them as if they're gospel. You know they're not true. She told you they weren't true, yet you put them on anyway. Your ratings for your entertainment show were more important than Jodi and the reaction that people were going to have about her. And like I said, any of the cops, any of the prosecutors, anybody who got in the way of the narrative of poor Stephen Avery was going to get trashed by this thing. And to hell with the truth. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Remember what Laura said, Laura Riccardi. I never said it was true. I just said it was entertainment.
So you've been on the other side of the Me Too movement and you admitted you were wrong. You've been punished. I mean, what's your view of it?
Actually, there's part of the allegations that were made against me that most people don't know. And I am so reluctant to talk about this because it always seems to me, at least, maybe it doesn't come off this way, but it seems to me that sounds like I'm making excuses. I'm not. I engaged in horrible behavior. I texted this crime victim. I reported myself to the Office of Lawyer Regulation. I accepted my punishment, and I have never made excuses for my terrible behavior. Having said that, the Department of Justice, when they first were made aware of the reaction from the general public to the OLR not sanctioning me or not punishing me for what had happened, DOJ put out a press release, an invitation for any other complainants to come forward, whether it was a criminal case or an ethics case. By the way, they had no right to investigate ethics charges, but they invited that anyway. Any kind of case, any kind of bad thing about Ken, we would like you to send us. And they did. They got 150 pages of allegations made against me. You know, Jerry Buting still is fond of saying, I believe 15 women. Well, what Jerry doesn't tell you, and what Making a Murderer certainly didn't tell you, was other than the self-proclaimed, that is when I self-reported that allegation, the serious allegations against me, sexting of a law student who, if she didn't have sex with me, she said, I was going to pull my pardon support for her. That was presented as an allegation. A rape allegation by a woman who had had some kind of contact with our office and flat out claimed that Ken Kratz raped me. All right. Mm-hmm. So those allegations are made against me on December 10th, 2011. After the formal complaint was filed by me, by the way, OLR gave it to the Associated Press before I even got it. The headline of the next day's paper read, Kratz charged or cited with sexual assault. Follow me here now. So accusing a sitting elected DA, an elected official, of sexually assaulting a young woman, that's serious stuff, right? Serious stuff that you would want to maybe check it out before you invited the Associated Press to print that. Well, they did check it out. They did check it out, Roberta. In fact, the Department of Justice investigated that rape claim, the Department of Justice determined that it was without merit, that it never happened, that this woman who has a history of lying, has a history of making up allegations, it never happened. And they came up with that conclusion. They filed that conclusion and they sent it to the OLR. OLR
Who
charged me
reported
anyway.
it? Did anyone report
Well,
on that?
listen, OLR charged me anyway with the sexual assault.
Oh, wow.
And they charged this law student sexting, where this woman, her name was Maria Ruskowitz, she claimed that I had texted her this quote, "How are you going to please me between the sheets?" Okay? So these are very damning allegations about me. And OLR makes the most out of them. They report them, certainly in the Associated Press, and then they go forward with them. What you're not told, Roberta, is that very shortly thereafter, OLR dismisses the rape case because they realize it never happened. They dismissed the sexting case by this law student because they got the text messages, and guess what? None of them were sexually explicit at all. I never said to her, "How will you please me between the sheets?" I never offered this pardon if she had sex with me. When she went on national TV and she said about me, this man should be disbarred forever, this man should never be allowed, and started this whole process. Maria Ruskowitz started the DOJ investigation. She started the governor's removal proceeding against me. She started the OLR reopening their case against me. And when they found out that she made it up, when they found out that she just wanted her 15 minutes of fame for this elected official that she was accusing of the sexual impropriety, when it turned out that I never made any of those things at all, they just dismissed it quietly. They never did another press release with the dismissed rape allegation that was fabricated, or with the sexting allegation that was fabricated. You talk about Me Too. You talk about the other side of Me Too, about elected officials who are accused of things and where the government is happy to print those things on the news. So when you ask me about the Me Too movement, I say, well, when Jerry Buting says I believe 15 people, I assume you're thinking that I violated some ethics or anything with 15 women. Turns out that zero of them had meritorious claims against me. None of them. It didn't happen. So you take this guy with a 25-year prosecution career, never had an ethics complaint against him ever, had been the chairman of the Crime Victims' Rights Board, had written or helped write the law, had supported, advocated for women and children and crime victims my entire career. And when these two women made up these allegations that later were proved to be false, and I and my lawyer at the time asked DOJ to prosecute these people for defamation, for making this up, DOJ said, well, it doesn't really have any statewide interest to us. I guess you're on your own. That's the answer I got. Somebody other than me has to talk about this, though, Roberta, because it sounds like I'm making up an excuse. I'm not. I self-reported the texting of that one crime victim. I said, suspend me for it. I agreed to all of that. But don't make it up that this was a pattern. Other than an isolated incident, don't pretend that I was a crook or that I was dishonest or that I was unethical. I never was in my 25-year prosecution career. So the fact that these things continue to be spread by people like Jerry Buting, who knows the answer, who knows that these things were dismissed, yet he keeps putting out this nonsense, somebody's got to hold them accountable for this, Roberta. I'm sick and tired of people just believing all of these things because I'm Ken Kratz, okay? Again, I'm not a victim. I'm not asking for sympathy. I don't want anybody's sympathy. I'm well over all of that. But before you start repeating any of this stuff, we're talking about my character. Let's find out exactly what it was that happened and exactly what those conclusions were of the DOJ and the OLR investigation, okay? So I invite anybody who's listening to this, I invite Jerry Buting. If you're listening, Jerry, I invite you to look at those cases and then come back and tell me, were any of them founded? Were any of the rape or sexting allegations proven to be true? The answer, Jerry, is no. I'll help you with that. I'm sorry about the spoiler alert, but your answer is going to be no. And you know it, and you keep talking about it. That's what angers me, Roberta.
Are you following at all the lawsuit of Netflix by the Read Technique people?
Not very much. I understand that's probably connected to the Central Park 5
Central
case,
Park
probably.
5? Yeah, I mean, that's a
Yeah,
case.
and so I knew that they had trashed Reed about that. By the way, you know that Laura Nyrider and Steve Drizzen used to advocate for the Reed technique. That they said this was the best interviewing technique. Before the WZ method, by the way, which is their new favorite partner, it's a for-profit organization that they've teamed up with, that they've advanced that particular thing. They even got them to write an amicus friend of the court brief. I don't know how a for-profit interviewing technique training corporation or whatever gets to do a friend of the court brief, but it was anti-Reed, right? That's what they were saying. Even though the Reed technique, the bad parts of the Reed technique weren't used with Brendan, none of the adversarial or accusatory things. This was the softest interview almost that you're ever going to see. So it wasn't any of the dangers that they identify with the Reed technique at all. Yet this guy, the president, I assume, of this company, the WZ method, says that, well, this confession is used nationwide as an example of a false confession. Well, duh, because you're the one that's saying it. You're the one that's using it in all your trainings. You don't say that, do you? And so all of these self-serving, this kind of inner circle, this group of Laura Nyrider supports WZ and WZ supports that this was a coerced confession and writes a brief and this incestuous kind of, all these people are in all these trainings together and making all this money together and presenting all this. And I don't fault them for making money. Go ahead. But don't do it on the back of Brendan Dassey. And don't pretend that Brendan Dassey's confession either A, was Reed technique, or B, was at all coerced. The courts have said it wasn't. Anybody who knows about this kind of stuff says that the Reed technique was not part of Brendan Dassey's confession. So quit lying about it. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, I just was reading the Reed technique. One of the things is reject denials at one point, but I don't know what just say, oh, I had nothing to do with it. Okay, great, go home.
Okay,
I don't know,
Yeah. Hey, here's another spoiler alert, Roberta. Everybody who's asked if they did the crime first says no, and then you say, what about all this? And then they say, yeah, I did it. That's how statements of admission are made. It starts with a denial. You then show them stuff that they're not being honest, and then they're honest, at least a percentage of honesty, as honest as they can be. It's not telling the cops what they want to hear. That's nonsense. Listen to Dassey's answers. They're nothing about what the cops want to hear, right? So this perpetuating this myth about this case or using it to advance either your own personal careers or your agenda for false confessions or whatever you're trying to do with this case. Pick another case, okay? Pick another case that's actually got a false confession in it. You don't need to pretend or to fit Dassey's square peg into that round hole, okay? It's not a false confession, so quit telling people it is.
So how much money do you think has been put into trying to overturn Brendan's case and Stephen Avery's case?
I don't know. It's not something that I can render an opinion on. I know how much it cost to try Stephen Avery. I knew that the total price tag for that prosecution was $72,000. Uh-huh. That's how much it was for a 7-week trial to prosecute him. The whole state side, the whole case of putting on our case was $72,000. Dean and Jerry alone got $240,000 for their case. Which side is poor people never get a
underdog.
Fair shake here,
They're
right?
The underdog.
So
right?
It's crazy.
No, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh. I lost track of time. I'm so sorry. Just quickly, there's one last part of your book where you said you're looking forward to retiring and playing your guitar and spending time with your wonderful wife. And I just had a hard time buying that. You just seem way too smart and intellectually engaged with life to do that. Do you think that's a realistic
Well, sure
goal?
I do. A lot of smart people retire, okay? And again, I don't ask for sympathy from anybody. Please don't take it this way. But I've been beat up pretty good the last 14 years. I need a break. I need some respite. I need to not be made out as I'm responsible for these two guys being in prison. I'm ready for some quiet. I'm ready to just hang out with Leah. You know Leah. We have a blast together. She's wonderful. My golden retriever is wonderful. And it's time I start enjoying those things and stop worrying so much about these two killers who, I've said everything I can say. I've put it out there, and I think it's getting pretty close to time for me to shut up now.
Okay, Avery is out, paperback version out now. Thank you so much, Ken Kratz. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Roberta. I appreciate having me on.